From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Abby Nolan, and I review children's books for the Washington Post. The Post is a charter sponsor for the book festival and has been a proud supporter for the last 12 years. So I'm very honored to introduce Avi, the author of more than 70 books, including modern-day classics like The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, Crispin, The Cross of Lead, City of Orphans, and his new book, Sophia's War. Avi was born and raised in New York City and has set several of his books there, including his latest, which takes place during the Revolutionary War. But he started out as a playwright and only began writing children's books when he became a father. His works have ranged from mysteries and historical fiction to animal stories to a comic book novel that was the first book to be illustrated by Brian Floca. Avi has won the Newbery Medal, the Newbery Honors, and many other awards, but he says that even now, writing's still hard. I'm sure we are all very grateful that he has made all the effort and continues to do so. Please help me welcome, all the way from Denver, Colorado, Avi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure to be here with you on this gorgeous day. And it's nice to know that the book is still alive. So I always think when I hear these introductions that she's reading my obituary, but I am getting on. So anyway, it's nice to be here and part of this wonderful celebration of the book. And yeah, it's about the authors, but you know, it's really about you, the readers. There's my favorite description of what is good writing was expressed. I heard a talk by the former poet laureate, Donald Hall. And he said, what the writer tries to do is write the perfect circle. But he doesn't write the circle, he writes something like the letter C. And if the gap is too big, the reader cannot fill it. If it is too small, then there's no reason for the reader to fill it. But if it's just right, the reader fills it with their own experience, and the circle is complete. And that seems to me a beautiful metaphor for what we as writers try to do. I have written a lot of books, and people say, why? And if you knew how many children I had, you would know the answer why. So I have children in Boston, I have children in New York, I have children in Honolulu, and I have one in my basement. So, but he's working very hard, and he's trying to be a writer too. That's why he's in the basement, you know. That's where writers start. Anyway, I do write. I write every day. I was up this morning writing, trying to write a new book and trying to make it something that you will read. The last book, the most recent book, I think it's published middle of next week, is called Sophia's War. It's a story about the American Revolution, but it's a story that people don't really know. In 1776, the British invaded New York area, and in the biggest battle of the war, called the Battle of Brooklyn, they defeated George Washington's army and pushed them out of the city of Manhattan, New York, and occupied Manhattan and stayed there for the length of the war. They occupied New York for the entire time. When they got there, the city was 5,000. When they left, the city was 55,000. Here's a curious fact. How do you think they fed all of those people on the island of Manhattan? I bet you don't know this. When I did the research for this, I learned, because on one side was New Jersey, occupied by the rebel army. north was the rebel army in New York, and up in Connecticut was the rebel army. So where did they get their food? It came from Ireland in great numbers of ships all the time to feed the people in New York. Now, what happens in New York is also the place where the British have their prisons. The captured Americans, and they put them in prisons, makeshift prisons, on prison ships. Here's a fact that most people don't know. During the war, the actual battles, the guess is that about 8,000 men, boys, teenagers, and women were killed on the field of battle. But in the British prisons, 18,000 died. Okay? And that's the premise of this book. Sophia, when the book begins, she witnesses what happens to Nathan Hale and goes home to her house with her mother and father. But missing is her brother William, who has fought in that battle at Brooklyn and has vanished. Is he dead? Is he captured? Has he escaped? Is he with George Washington's army? They don't know. At the same time in New York, the British, to find places for their officers to live, could knock on your door and say, from now on, one of our officers is going to live here. And they do that in Sophia's house, and into her house comes a man named John Andre. How many of you know that name, John Andre? You really do, but you don't know it. In fact, he's buried in Westminster Abbey in what's called the Heroes' Corner. Well, Sophia asked John Andre to help. He's a young, dashing, gallant, flute-playing. He speaks 3 languages, handsome. She flirts with him. He flirts with her. She's 12. She sort of falls in love, call it a crush, if you will. Will you help me get my brother out of prison? They find out he's in prison. He refuses. I won't tell you what happens to William. Well, who is this John Andre? Here's another name I bet you know. How many of you ever heard of Benedict Arnold? Ah, there you go. When Benedict Arnold is negotiating with the British to turn over West Point to the British and capture George Washington, who is he negotiating with? John Andre. You knew that. Okay. Now, Sophia, after what happens to her brother, no spoilers here, she is recruited as a spy. And eventually, she's placed in the headquarters of General Clinton. And Clinton is the commander-in-chief of the British forces. And that's where she learns about this treason plot. By now, she's 15. Who's going to believe her that the most successful, most celebrated officer in the American Army is going over to the British? It would be as if when you turned on the news tonight, you heard that General Petraeus had gone over to the Taliban. You wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't even think it's possible, and of course it's not, but that's comparable to what's going on here. So Sophia wants to stop what's going to happen. Now, if you read the history of the Arnold conspiracy, it doesn't work, you know that. But why doesn't it work? Well, a couple of things happen that no historians have ever been able to fully explain. Coincidences, luck, miracles. What happened? I know what happened. There's Sophia. And she is involved, and what she does is what this book is all about. So let me just read you the opening chapter so that you get a feel for what's happening and the way the book is written. And here it goes. Dear reader, it's a terrible thing to see a man hang, But that is why I did what I did. Was I right to act in such a way? You must decide. And if, when you reach my last words, you cannot forgive me, so be it. Just know that although you will not find me in any history book, I shall tell the truth about what happened, no matter how painful to me, the authoress of these words. For on these pages, I have dared to put my trust in your heart. Sophia Calderwood. In the momentous year of 1776, on the 22nd of September, my mother and I were rushing back to the city of New York. New York was where I was born and where I had lived peacefully until just a few weeks before, when we had fled in fear of our lives. The war for our country's independence had come to our door. First, my brother William, along with thousands of other patriot soldiers, ferried across the East River to the village of Brooklyn to defend the city from a British attack. Alarmed by the danger, my father warned us we might have to leave. And indeed, the Americans lost that battle and retreated through Manhattan as Great Britain gained complete control of the city. But there was no news of William. Desperately worried, I could only hope he was still with General Washington's army and not taken prisoners. At times, though no one spoke it, we feared he had been killed. Too frightened to wait until we could find out, Father had said we must leave our house. It was a wise decision, because soon after the British troops left New York, occupied New York, a fire erupted and destroyed many buildings. But since we had taken flight to a friend's farm north of the city, we lacked information about our home's condition. And knowing that everything we had, money and possessions, might have been consumed in the fire, much of our lives was in awful derangement. After some days passed, Father and Mother decided that we must go home, if we still had one, and tried to reclaim our lives. Not sure how to secure the way, Father made the decision that Mother and I, being females, should travel first. It was his belief that English soldiers would not harm a mother and child. Are they not, he said, our kinsmen and a civilized people? Moreover, we would travel on Sunday, Lord's Day. Surely all would be peaceful. As soon as Father determined that the roads were not dangerous, he would follow. And so it was before dawn on Sunday morning, Mother and I, full of disquietude, set out to walk the 12 miles to the city. With me clutching Mother's hand tightly and barely looking up, we took the road called Harlem Lane. I may have been willowy for my 12 years of age, and my name was Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom, but you could just as well have called me frightened and be done with it. In truth, as we hurried home, all my thoughts were on William. He must come home. It was late morning when we reached the outskirts of New York. By then, my wood-soled shoes were soaking wet, my ankle-length linsey-woolsey dress was mud-spattered, and the laces of my bonnet, a mobcat, would not stay tied. As we approached the ripe apple orchard, we observed a group of red-coated British soldiers armed with muskets and bayonets marching toward us. An officer, a heavy, sweating man with a nose as bright red as his hair and uniform, strode along in high black jackboots. Following him was a Negro, his slave, I supposed. In the middle of the soldiers was a man whose hands were tied behind his back, looking to be in his mid-20s and some 6 feet in height. He was considerably taller than the soldiers who surrounded him. Dressed in civilian clothing, he wore no jacket and had a white muslin shirt open at the collar. His light brown hair was arranged pigtail style. In the slanting morning light, I noticed his blue eyes. I will admit, I thought him handsome. The young man walked with a dignified bearing, but his face was anything but serene. Rather, he bore a look of pale, raw intensity, with a gaze that appeared to be of nothing and everything at the same moment. "What are they doing with that young man?" I said in a low voice to Mother. She squeezed my hand, and in as fearful a voice as I had ever heard her utter, she said, "I think they are about to hang him." Open-mouthed, I watched as the men approached an apple tree upon which a ladder leaned. From a stout branch a noose hung. Just beyond gaped an open grave with a gravedigger standing by, shovel in hand. We stopped and, along with a few other citizens, watched. When the officer shoved the prisoner to the foot of the ladder, I heard the young man say, "May I have a Bible?" His voice, low and steady, broke on the last word. "No Bibles for damn rebel spies," the officer shouted, as if he wished us onlookers to hear. "Hoist him," he commanded. 3 redcoats, their faces blank, stepped forward. 2 grabbed the young man's arms as if to restrain him, though I saw no attempt of his to break free. Would that he had. The 3rd soldier placed the noose round the prisoner's neck and forced him up the ladder steps, even as another drew the rope tight under his chin. As they did these things, each beat of the pulsing drum stabbed my heart. Mother covered her lips with her fingers. "Do you wish to confess?" the officer shouted. "I think," the youth replied, but I was so appalled I could not comprehend his words. In fact, such was my distress, I cried, "Have pity, sir, for God's sake." The officer glared at me. "Be still, missy, or you'll come to the same fate." I shrank behind Mother, but peeked round to watch. The officer turned back to the soldiers and shouted, "Swing the rebel off!" One of the soldiers kicked the ladder away. The young man dropped. I gasped. His neck must have broken, for he died in an instant. Perhaps that was God's mercy. Sometimes a hanging is nothing but slow strangulation. Mother, pulling my hand, said, "Sophia, come." Sobbing, I stumbled away. Later, we learned that the young man's name was Nathan Hale, and over time his death proved of greater consequence than his life. Without any doubt, it altered the history of my country as it altered mine. Indeed, what I had just witnessed was the beginning of my extraordinary adventures. I shall tell you what happened. There it is. And what happens is indeed Sophia's war, and it's a war on a number of levels. It's the war for independence, but it's also the war within herself. What does she feel? What is she doing? What is her feelings about John Andre? And there you go, that's the whole story. What you will find if you read the book is that everything, when you do research of this kind, and particularly in this episode, this famous episode, there's been so much research about it that everything that's in the book is absolutely true. All the characters are real. There's a moment when John Andre, when he's trying to escape, he sees a boy on the road. There's no one else there. It's a little kid. And he says, "What's the way to a town, which is the British lines, which he's getting close to?" And the kid tells him, and he gives the kid 6 pence, a coin. That's a fact. People have studied this and know this. I know what coat Andre wore. I know how Arnold looked. I know what the water in the Hudson River was like and how it was rising and falling and what the city looked. There's a doctor in the book. I know his name. I know where he lived on Broadway. One of the most extraordinary things that I saw very recently in this book is a prison, a British prison. It's where William is. And Sophia goes to see it. And I try to describe it as much as I could from the records and so forth. I wrote the book. And this was a famous prison, a notorious prison. It was called the Sugar House. And recently I went to New York City, to give a talk. And before I went, I discovered that somebody, no idea who, when the sugar house was finally pulled down in the 1840s, it was such a notorious place that somebody removed the barred window, one barred window, and placed it in a wall. And I went and I saw it. You can go see it. It's in New York, downtown New York, just embedded in a wall. People pass by, have no idea what it is, with a little plaque, but it's there. And in a funny way, what's happening as this book begins to circulate, there's an important canon in this story. It's part of what happens. I get an email, read your book. I know where that canon is. There's a monument. They took that canon and it sits in front of a city hall up in upstate New York. And I suspect that as this book begins to circulate, I'll get more and more things that people have found or located that are really part, because it's a real story. So it's a completely true story, except it's fictitious. But you will read, and everything that's in the story is true, except what makes it all happen is Sophia. I have written a lot of historical fiction. The book right before this was also set in New York City. I feel like I'm in exile. Maybe that's what it is, living in the mountains of Colorado as opposed to the mountains of Manhattan. And that story, City of Orphans, takes place in New York, takes place at the end of the 19th century, and it deals with an immigrant family from Denmark living on what's now called the Lower East Side. And it's a family story, and it's about immigrant life. The term City of Orphans, when immigrants came to America, and many of them came through Ellis Island, of course, but they stayed in New York, and they brought their children, and they had children. But what were you to do with the children? And the city was full of children. Any records that you read of New York City at that time, that there were thousands of kids on the street. And these were kids who very quickly become Americanized. They speak English, they know the mores or whatever. It's a very rough life. Often they're abandoned, they're often homeless. And they are, as it were, orphans, but they have parents. But the separation between parents and kids is so great. And that's what that story is, about a city of these kids and how they operate and so forth and so on. So I used to be a librarian, a research librarian. I worked for the New York Public Library for many years, and I learned to do research, and that helps me write the books and so forth. But I also used to teach people how to do research, and I have a standing bet that I can teach anybody how to do historical research if you give me 10 minutes of your time and you listen hard. It's extraordinarily easy once you know how to do it. And I'll be happy to teach anyone. So let me see if there are any questions that anyone wants to ask. I'm happy to ask. You can ask absolutely anything. Yes? Nice and loud. Excuse me? Oh, we have microphones. There you go. If you have a question, get by the phones. Okay.
I have a question about your book, The Good Dog.
The Good Dog. Okay.
The streets that are in McKinley's Head, like Porcupine Road, are they real, or is it just what he thinks?
Well, that also takes place in a real town called Steamboat Springs, which is in Colorado. But I have to admit something. It's about a dog named McKinley. And I own a dog named McKinley. And I did not write that book. McKinley wrote that book. However, he's a Malamute. I don't know if you've ever seen Malamutes. They weigh about 110 pounds. They pull sleds. And they have enormous feet. And I set him in front of my computer, and it was a mess. He just couldn't do that. So I said, look, just tell me the story and dictate it. And so that's how it came to be. Okay?
And I have two more questions.
Well, let's go to somebody else, okay? Yes.
How do you, is there a connection in your life about Emma going to jail and,
Is there a connection to my life about Emma going to jail?
uh-huh.
Well, I have never gone to jail. But I have known people by the name of Emma, and they didn't go to jail. The way I learn about these things is I read a lot. You know, I believe, here's my credo, my motto. Writers don't write writing, they write reading. Writers don't write writing, they write reading. So everything I do, I try to make for reading. Okay, let's go to this side. Yeah.
How many books have you made?
How many books have I written? Well, that's a sneaky way of saying how many bad books I wrote. I've published 73, but there are a few that I never get published because they were no good. Sorry. Yes?
Hi, my students Skyped with you at the end of my last year masterman school in Philadelphia, and I do want to thank you because even though they read your blog online and said to read and read and read, they went home and when they start the school this year, we see them for like 15 minutes, and I can't tell you how many students said, I read and read and read and read and read all summer.
Oh, cool.
So it was so fabulous.
Oh, great, great.
Hey.
I should tell you, let me explain. I have a website, like so many of us do. There are two things on there that would be of interest, particularly teachers and librarians. I do blog. I hate the word. It sounds gross. But it's not personal stuff. It's all about writing and reading. And it's meant for teachers and librarians and students as prompts, as a point of discussion. What does the editor do? Is spelling important? What does it feel like to get a bad review or a good review? Things like that. So it's meant for the classroom. The other thing is, as you heard just mentioned, I do Skype. I Skype all the time with people, mostly in the United States, but around the world. You go to my website, it tells you how to set it up. I try to make it as absolutely cheap as possible, and you don't have to pay me to come, and then you don't have to put up with me, and just have a good conversation with your students. Yeah?
So, where do you get the inspiration for most of your books?
From you. Do you read my books?
Yeah.
You're my inspiration.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. There you go. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I am excited, so you're right about that. I've been reading and loving your books since my sister gave me The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle when I was little, and I love it. But because of what you wrote, and you do tend towards historical fiction, I got to really love to read and to write historical fiction, and I'm hoping to finish my first manuscripts by January 1st.
Uh-oh, competition. You see what happens? You encourage people. And yes, go ahead.
I think you're pretty safe. But I was really interested, I mean, you talked about the exhaustive research you do. I've been trying to do that, and it's so hard. There's so many little things you have to know. So I'm interested in that 10 minutes you have on research.
I can tell you right away. Should I tell you how to do it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, it's very easy. First of all, occasionally I've done original research. And the way you do that, you basically find out where the information, the original materials are. For example, curiously enough, all the letters that General Arnold sent to the British, they exist in the United States, in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. It's another story how they got there. But you find that, and you can apply, and you can get in. When I did the book called Iron Thunder about the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, I went to the wonderful museum at Newport News called the Mariners Museum, and they let me read this stuff, and the logs and letters from the captain, and it's great stuff. But most of the research I get is from books. One of the things about books is that anybody has written about something. There's nothing you can't find out that hasn't been written. Here's the way it works. You get a basic book about the American Revolution, something that's you can track down whether it has good reviews, reputable, correct? What you do is you then look at the back of the book in the bibliography. Learn to read bibliographies. That will guide you to other books. And now, here's where the internet comes on. You can track down these books and buy them for a pittance. And then when you get those books, look at those bibliographies. So in essence, other people are doing this research and telling you where you can find this information. And it's all there. When I wrote the sequel to Crispin, and Crispin is racing through the woods of medieval England, I suddenly said, what kind of trees were in medieval England? Get a book on medieval English history. Get another one and track it down. There's a book called The Forests of Medieval England. It's really not that hard. Now, the facts, in a sense, are easy. The hard part is the good story and using the facts in such a way that you're not hitting your reader over the head with, this is a fact. But you use the fact as part of the physicality of the story, and then you can function that way. Does that help? Okay, great. But try not to write a better book than me, that's it. You owe me that at least, okay. Yeah?
Is your real name Avi?
Avi? It stands for Audio-Visual Education. Or instruction, is the case. Would you like to know where the name comes from? Most people are named by their parents. Were you named by your parents? I was named by my sister. There's two parts to this story. I have a perfectly reasonable name, Edward, but my twin sister couldn't or wouldn't or whatever say the word, and she called me something that sounded like Avi. And it stuck. So it's like lots of people have a name they only use at home. That's my name. Why don't I use the last name? It's a complicated story. The short of it is that when I announced as a teenager that I was going to be a writer, my family was very much opposed to it. It wasn't opposition because they thought writing was a bad idea, but they thought my writing was bad. So, when I had my first book published, and this is a revenge story, I wasn't going to put their name on my books. There you go. So parents, if you have young people who want to be writers and you want your name on those books, encourage them, okay? There you go. Yeah.
I just first want to say that I love your books, and I think that Nothing But the Truth is one of the classics of American literature.
Well,
so thank you for writing that.
Thank you.
My question is, what do you do in a typical day when you're on a deadline to write a book? What's
I write
your
it.
style? What's your schedule?
My schedule, I get up and sit down and write. And I get up and go to bed. That's what it is. It's writing is writing. Now, bear in mind, and it's really important, go to my blog and you'll see I talk about this, but don't forget that thinking is a large degree of writing. So if I'm jogging or I'm walking and I'm talking to you, I'm really thinking about the book. I'm just putting on this act, see? So here I am, here in Washington. I mean, this is typical. I have a book that's due, and on the airplane, I wrote it all the time. I come to Washington, it's a beautiful day, all these incredible museums, place to do. What do? I think hard for about 4 minutes, and I say, you need to stay in this room and work on the book. So, because I was dealing with a particular thing, and I did. And then this morning at 6 o'clock, I was working again. So, writing is work. It's no different than other work, except you got to do it on your own. And so I do it all the time. And not always a good thing, but that's the way I do it. It's 73 books. In another couple of months, I'll be 75 years old. And the way it worked is 73 books. They gave me 2 years to learn the language. And then by the time I was 3, I wrote the first book. And then a book a year. That's That's what it takes, okay? So get busy. Have you written your book yet? First book? No, get busy, get busy, get busy.
So, what's your favorite part of writing
My favorite
a book?
part?
And what's the hardest part?
Favorite part is when somebody like you says it's a good book. That's nice. The favorite part is when I think really I've written something good, and you don't always know it. It takes a while to get a sense of it. It takes me about a year to write a book, sometimes longer, sometimes a little less. And my writer friend Betty Miles once said to me, and she's absolutely right, you don't feel like a writer until you're working on a book for 7 months or something, and then it begins to feel good. The worst part is getting turned down. You work on a book, it does happen, and the editor says, you know, it's really not that good. So that's very hard. But you keep doing it. I keep doing it. So there you go. Over this side. Yeah.
What gave you the idea to write the beginning of the end?
The beginning? The end of the beginning? This is a very silly story, and I really like silly stuff. It's full of puns and jokes and so forth. But the central thing is about an ant who's excessively busy, right? And a snail who's excessively slow. I was visiting a friend of mine, and his name was Avon, and he's a writer, was a writer. He's no longer with us. And he was working, and I was working, and he was so slow. I said, Avon, I'm going to write a book about how slow you are. And you heard me mention my real name is what? Edward. So Edward the ant, that's me, and Avon is my friend, the writer, who's slow. Okay? That's where it started. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
What author do you feel that you're most at competition with?
Most? Who am I in competition with? Shakespeare, Dickens, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Mark Twain. Do I have to keep going? James Joyce, Dr. Rowe. I mean, who else? I mean, all these great writers. You know, but I'm not in competition. Competition, you know, I can be, to be fair and honest, I can be envious. I wish I was successful like that. But you know, I really feel that I don't want you to just read my books. I want you to read lots of other books. And to the extent that you include me in your reading, that's terrific. This is not a sporting event. It's a way of living and life and experiencing life and getting joy and laughing and crying and being tense. So the more you read, the happier I am. So bring it on with all those wonderful people, okay? So I feel. Yeah. I love that pink. I love that pink. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to know, what is it like to write books?
What's it like to write a book? What I think happens if you read a lot, and I was read to and read from an early age and was a voracious reader and still am, if you're lucky, you begin to think like a writer. And what does that mean? You begin to see the world as a story. I have a son who's a musician. He sees the world as full of sound and melody. My wife is a businesswoman. She sees the world in terms of business and the way business works and so forth, right? My daughter is studying to be a doctor. She sees the world in terms of science. I see the world in terms of story and words. So what does it feel like to be the author? What it feels like is that I'm seeing the world and taking the world that I see and putting it in a way that I can share it with somebody else. That's the closest. Nobody's ever asked me that quite that way, and that's the best I could come with. Does that make a little sense? A little bit. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
In your book, The True
That's a great book you have in your hand.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
In the book, The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, what inspired Charlotte and the sailors? I just really like the way they're so real.
I wish I knew. That's probably my most well-known book and most widely read book. You know, writers can be lucky. You're at a place, you're at a moment, you get to think of something, you begin to phrase it. I would be distrustful of any writer who told you, I wrote this book for this reason, and this happened. A lot of it is the way you feel, the way you react to the book, the way the book reacts to you. You read your own book, you invent your book, but your book invents you too. So I can't really answer the question except that it was very vivid to me as I wrote it, and as I suggested, it's the way I see the world, and I was lucky to capture it in such a way that it has so much meaning to so many people. That's the best I can do. Yeah.
In your opinion, what is the best book you've written?
In my opinion, I haven't written it yet. At least I hope not. I would hate to, you know, as a writer, and I think this is true for any writer, to think that my best book was something I wrote 30 years ago. I really mean it. I want the next book to be the best book. And I want the really best book to be published posthumously. So that is to say, after I die, and then people read it and say, oh, what a loss. We really miss this guy. Whoa, let's bring him back. So I told my wife, she once asked me, I don't know why, she said, do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? And I said, I want one of those huge concrete monuments with weeping angels and lions around and a little bench. And if you sit on the bench, you hear my voice telling you a story. That's I think that'd be cool, right? That'd be good. Yeah.
What do you do when you reach writer's block?
Writer's block. Writer's block usually means one of two things. It's actually a serious mental condition. It's a form of depression that some writers, they basically become frightened of what they're writing, I think, is the way to explain it, and they can't write. Happily, that has never happened to me. What most young people mean by writer's block is getting stuck and not sure what to do next. That happens to me 60 times a day. And it's important that you know that, because particularly for young people, when you write, the same thing happens to you, but you think that I and other writers just let it all flow out. How many times, when you write something in school, how many times do you rewrite it before you're done?
3.
3. You must be fantastic. Because before I am finished with one of my books, I have to rewrite it 60 or 70 times. So if you're doing it 3 times, you are incredible. Seriously, the more you rewrite, the better the writer you are. And if you think getting stuck is a problem, then you can't be a writer, because being stuck is what the writer always is. It's a process. It's thinking. It's rewriting. Writing is rewriting, and that's truly the way it works. Okay, we're going to run out of time here, so let's get your question. Yeah?
Have you ever had any legal problems with your books?
What kind of problems?
Legal problems?
Legal? Not yet, no. Are you have something in mind? He's going to run up here and slap a subpoena on me. Yeah.
Have you ever been accused, or anyone accused somebody else of copying ideas from other books?
Have they accused me of that?
Yeah.
No, but, let me explain something that's really important. If you live in this world that I live in, and we share this world, you're going to see things that I see. You're going to learn about things that I learn. So let's say you write about something that happened in Washington, say the burning of the White House, and you write that story. That doesn't mean to say I can't write that story or you can't write the story. That's not plagiarism. There's no way in the world that you can write what I write. And I can't write what you would write. Sometimes people write about somewhat the same things, and it's because they find it interesting or it's a coincidence. It's not important. Plagiarism does happen. It's not really important. So it happens so rarely. So, okay, did you have a question, or are you trying to get me off the stage? No.
No, my question is, I'd just like to know some titles of books that have evoked a great response in you. Like books that made you laugh, books that made you cry, books that made you really think. And as a teacher, I like to hand those books and say, try this.
Well, goodness gracious. I mean, probably the books that I really adore and I read when I was young. I mean, when I was young, in the 19th century, that is, the books that were available for young people were not as many, were not as good as today. So the choices were limited. I mean, I read huge quantities of the Hardy Boys and Tom Swift and so forth and so on. But there were some books. I mean, The Wind in the Willows is one of the great works of the English language, I think. So is Treasure Island. I recently read for maybe the 5th time Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. And I read it and I say to myself, oh my God, I call myself a writer. How does he do this? I mean, and so forth. The trick is read a bad book and then you're okay. You can. Let me say something about that. I got a minute, and it's a weird way to end. But sometimes in schools, the kids don't read enough bad books. And I mean by that, you give them all this good stuff. Thank you. But they can't do that. But there are other books, potboilers, not so good, that they can see through and see the structure. Don't always feed, it's like taking kids to see an NBA game and then say, let's go play out in our gym. They can't do what those guys do. But take them to another school where they play, and they can play as well as that. You need to show balance in what you give kids so that they can aspire to something. You think that you're doing a lot by all this great stuff. Yeah, but maybe sometimes what's not so good teaches just as well. All right? She's kicking me off. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.